It can sometimes be challenging to develop e-learning programs to help learners build soft skills like stress management, communication, and teamwork. Soft skills are often abstract and difficult to measure, and they can require quite a bit of practice to master. So to be really effective, we want the e-learning course to support a lot of directed practice without getting too repetitive and without creating a huge amount of work for you, the designer. So can games help with any of that? Of course they can. Let's find out how. Let's use an example. Say I want to teach the soft skill of conflict resolution, and I'm teaching a method that happens in 4 phases. Ask clarifying questions to pinpoint the source of the conflict, challenge each party's assumptions, offer alternatives, and agree on common ground. By the way, I'm making up this method. I am not a SME in this field of conflict resolution. Like any skill, soft skills are made up of theoretical information and practical application. So this 4-step method is the theoretical knowledge that I need to get into the learner's head, and then once they know it, they have to practice it to internalize it and develop the right habits. That's the practical application part. So before we start thinking about how to teach this, we need to start by thinking about how we're going to measure success. This, of course, will be different for my theoretical information versus my practical application. In this example, the theoretical information is knowing the 4 phases of the method in order, knowing the kinds of questions you should ask at each phase, and knowing when to move on to the next phase. So it's pretty easy to check if someone's understood that. If they go through each phase in the correct order and ask the right kinds of questions at each phase, they've got it. But to really build a soft skill, it's not enough to just mechanically ask the right questions in the right order. We're not training a bot here. But unlike the theoretical information, which you either know it or you don't, when it comes to practical application, they're going to improve gradually over a spectrum of skill as they practice. So we want to know where they are on that spectrum so we can provide feedback, celebrate every bit of progress along the way, and even adjust the challenges we present based on the learner's current skill level. So to measure that precisely, I'm going to use what I call a skill dimension that I can measure: accuracy, speed, quality, etc. That's what improves with practice. If the skill is archery, the skill dimension is probably accuracy. If it's typing, then maybe the skill dimensions are accuracy and speed. That's what you're trying to improve. So in my case, I've decided that my skill dimension is the quality of the responses. So each response the learner gives throughout a conflict will be scored, and those scores pulled together will give me their overall performance. So that gives me a nice range of possible scores, and that's going to help me create some replayability, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on in this video. Now, how do we teach this soft skill? I could teach them the 4 phases of the method, i.e. the theoretical information, and then make them practice that separately, but I'm going to try and streamline this into one common activity that'll achieve both. That's how games teach. They put you in the driver's seat right from the start, and they keep throwing challenges your way through which you learn actively. So let's say I create a conflict scenario. The cat says, "Dog is always eating my food," and I'm going to take the learner through the 4 phases of this method using this conflict. Phase 1 is to ask clarifying questions, so I'm going to get the learner to pick the best question for that phase, and each option has a quality rating. This here is a good question to ask in this phase, but this one not so much. I'm asking them to pick, and I'm asking them in a way that gives them hints about what they should be looking for here. I'm showing them the phase they're in, and I'm specifically asking for a question that will seek clarification on what the cat just said. I am not starting by explaining what the phase is about and what questions to ask. I'm letting them discover that by going through it and puzzling it out for themselves. So this first scenario of cat and dog focuses on helping them understand what each phase is about. As they go through more cycles of practice, I can gradually make things harder. I can give them less and less information to help them make the best choice, so now they have to remember what kinds of questions are appropriate for each phase. I can also make it harder by making the choices more similar, or I can give them more choices to pick from. That makes the practice increasingly challenging as their skill develops. But my course isn't just about picking the right questions to ask. So as we go, I'm also gonna gradually layer in some new concepts. For example, eventually I can make them craft the best question themselves instead of picking it from a list. Maybe in the later levels, they have to pick who the next question should go to, dog or cat, before picking what question to ask. And maybe eventually they have to determine when it's time to move on to the next phase of the method. All the sub-skills that go into being a good conflict resolver get layered in gradually as you go. But whenever I do add something new, I initially provide guidance to help them figure out how to do it correctly, and then I take away those training wheels once they've got it. The idea is that by the end, I want them working in nearly real-world conditions, which means doing all the things, applying all the concepts simultaneously with no guidance at all, or with the amount of guidance and support that they'll have in the real world. Alright, so now you've layered in all the things and you have your final scenario in real-world conditions. Great. But like I mentioned, soft skills might require a lot of practice, so you want to support that by providing lots of opportunities to do that. Of course, you can make a bunch of different conflict scenarios, but that's a lot of work. Instead, let's see if we can make our existing scenarios play out slightly differently each time. That reduces your workload and keeps the scenarios fresh for the learner. Now, the way we've built the existing scenarios, they're already a little bit replayable. In each one, the learner has several responses to give, each of which is rated. So they could replay one and pick different combos to try to get a perfect score. But each time they play, the experience does stay exactly the same. So once they've nailed the perfect responses, that's it, that scenario is solved. So I want to inject a type of variation that'll force the learner to think slightly differently each time they play through the same scenario. So one thing we can do is we can vary the options at each step. So here are the options I have right now, and each one has a different quality rating. But I could also take these randomly from a pool of possible responses. So this same scenario would actually be slightly different every time. I can also vary what the characters say each time. So maybe sometimes when I'm asking a clarifying question, the cat just says meh and doesn't give me a real answer. In that case, I shouldn't move on to the next phase. I should ask another clarifying question. So that changes what the right move is here and forces the learner to act differently. So the same scenario can be presented in a lot of different ways. You're varying the amount of guidance you're giving, you're varying the tasks the learner has to perform. Sometimes they pick questions, sometimes they have to craft questions. All of these options give you control over the difficulty so that the challenge remains at just the right spot for that learner. On top of that, you can of course take a scenario and just change the characters, the setting, or the topic of the conflict. But note that here you'd only be varying the container, which is fine to break the monotony. But if you want to maintain cognitive engagement, you should favor variations that push the learner to approach the problem in a new way. And finally, you can even have those elements adjust automatically based on the learner's particular learning gaps to make the training even more perfectly adapted to them. That really boosts the effectiveness and the relevance even more. But that's another topic for another time. For now, I hope these tips were helpful to you, and if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate a like or a comment below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.